This is the story about a Michigan drag racer who outsmarted Ford with a banned Boss 429 tunnel port that made 900 horsepower. Here's the thing about the year 1970. It was the absolute peak of the American muscle car wars. We talk about it now like it was some golden age of freedom, but if you were actually there, standing in the pits at the NHRA Winter Nationals, it felt more like a literal arms race. You had Chrysler pouring millions into the 426 Hemi, which was basically a boss saw that ate everything in its path. You had Chevrolet backdooring aluminum ZL1 427s to anyone with a devastating checkbook. And then you had Ford. This is legacy motoring, and I spent way too much time thinking about forgotten racing engines that were way too powerful for their own good. If you're someone who loves stories about mechanical geniuses outsmarting billion-dollar corporations, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. Now, you might be thinking, wait a minute, Ford had the Boss 429. That engine is a legend. And you're right, it is a legend today. But here's what most people don't realize. In 1969 and early 1970 on the professional drag strip, the Boss 429 was struggling. It was massive, it was complicated, and in the heavy Mustang chassis, it was getting its doors blown off by lightweight Chevy Novas and Hemi Darts. The brass in Dearborn were panicking. They had spent a fortune homologating this blue Crescent engine for NASCAR, but on the quarter mile, it was looking like a very expensive paperweight. But while Ford's factory engineers were wringing their hands and trying to play by the rules, one man in Michigan decided to stop playing games. His name was Dino Don Nicholson, and he didn't just want to make the Boss 429 faster, he wanted to build something that would make a 426 Hemi look like a sewing machine. The story I'm about to tell you is about an engine that technically never existed. If you looked in the 1970 Ford performance catalog, you wouldn't find it. If you asked a dealer, they'd tell you you were crazy. But for 3 glorious months in the summer of 1970, this ghost engine didn't just win, it forced the NHRA to rewrite the entire rulebook. This is the story of the tunnel port Boss 429, the 900 horsepower mistake that Ford tried to bury, and the one racer who refused to let it die. To really understand the gravity of what Nicholson did, we have to look at the engineering landscape of 1970. The standard Boss 429 head was a semi-Hemi design. It was good. It had massive valves and decent flow, but it had a fatal flaw for high RPM drag racing. The intake ports had to curve around the push rods to get to the combustion chamber. In the world of fluid dynamics, every curve is a restriction. Every restriction is lost horsepower. Ford's advanced engineering department knew this. In fact, they had been secretly working on a solution for their Can-Am racing program, those unlimited wide-body monsters that raced in the SCCA. They developed a cylinder head design called the tunnel port. The idea was radical but simple. Instead of snaking the intake port around the pushrod, they just ran the pushrod through the center of the port. It sounded crazy, sticking a metal tube right in the middle of the airflow path, but the math worked. By straightening out the port, the air had a direct, unobstructed shot at the intake valve. Here is where it gets interesting. These tunnel port heads were never intended for a drag car. They were essentially laboratory experiments. The airflow numbers were staggering. Testing showed they flowed nearly 50% more air than a standard Boss 429 head at high lift. We're talking about flow numbers that modern race engines struggle to hit. But Ford killed the program. The executives got cold feet. The budget was cut. The order came down from the top: destroy the prototypes, melt them down, forget it ever happened. But this is the automotive industry in Detroit. Destroy is a relative term. Somehow, and the details are still murky 50 years later, a few sets of these experimental castings didn't make it to the smelter. They fell off a truck, or maybe they were mislabeled as scrap. However it happened, a set of these raw, unmachined castings ended up in the hands of Don Nicholson. Now, you have to understand who Dyno Don was. He wasn't just a driver. He earned the nickname Dyno for a reason. He was one of the first racers to religiously use an engine dynamometer to tune his cars. He was a scientist in a fire suit. When he looked at these raw castings, he didn't see a pile of aluminum. He saw the Holy Grail. Most guys would have looked at these heads and given up. Why? Because nothing fit. The bolt patterns were standard, sure, but the geometry was alien. The intake ports were so large they looked like drainage pipes. A standard intake manifold wouldn't cover them. The pushrod angles were all wrong. The valve train geometry was a nightmare. To run these heads, you couldn't just bolt them on. You had to redesign the entire top half of the engine from scratch. And that is exactly what Nicholson did. He didn't just build an engine. He orchestrated a symphony of mismatched parts and custom fabrication. He started with the intake manifold. Since nothing off the shelf existed, he had to build one. He fabricated a sheet metal intake with runners that looked like they belonged on a Saturn V rocket. They were massive, straight tubes that fed directly into those hungry tunnel ports. Then came the valve train. Because the ports went straight through the head, the push rods had to be sleeved. He had to work out custom rocker arm ratios to get the valves to open far enough to actually use that airflow. See, a port that big doesn't wake up until you lift the valve way off the seat. Nicholson knew he needed massive lift. We're talking over 0.700 inches of lift. In 1970, that was astronomical. It was break your valve springs in 3 seconds territory. But he made it work. He stuffed this Frankenstein monster of an engine into his 1970 Ford Maverick, and this is a key detail. While the factory team was running Mustangs, Nicholson preferred the Maverick. It was lighter, smaller, and punched a smaller hole in the air. A 900 horsepower engine in a tin can Maverick, it was a recipe for absolute chaos. When he finally got the engine on the dyno, the numbers were terrifying. At idle, it sounded like a jackhammer fighting a chainsaw. It wouldn't run below 1500 RPM. But when he opened the throttle, look, 600 horsepower was considered world-class in 1970. The best Hemis were making maybe 650 or 700 on a perfect day. Nicholson's tunnel port Boss 429 pulled 911 horsepower at 8,200 RPM. Let that sink in. Naturally aspirated, no turbo, no supercharger, no nitrous oxide. Just atmospheric pressure and genius engineering. That is more than 2 horsepower per cubic inch, a benchmark that is still the gold standard for race engines today. He took this car to the track and nobody noticed. Why? Because from the outside, it looked like just another Boss 429. The headers were tucked, the hood scoop was standard. He didn't paint tunnel port on the side. He just rolled into the staging lanes at the NHRA Summer Nationals, did his burnout, and staged the car. The guy in the other lane was probably driving a Camaro or a Cuda, thinking he had a chance. He didn't. When the light turned green, the Maverick didn't just leave the line, it vanished. Nicholson was shifting at 8,500 RPM. The sound was distinct, a high-pitched scream that hurt your ears. By the time he hit second gear, he was 2 car lengths ahead. By the finish line, he was in a different zip code. He ran a 9.81 at 136 miles per hour. The record for the class was a 10.10. He didn't just break the record, he shattered it. He went so fast that the announcers assumed the timing clocks were broken. But then he did it again and again. The pits at the Summer Nationals went absolutely dead silent. You know that feeling when something impossible happens and your brain just refuses to process it? That was the atmosphere. Racers were walking over to Nicholson's pit area, not to congratulate him, but to stare. They stood around that Maverick like it was a crashed UFO. They were looking for the nitrous bottle. They were looking for the hidden fuel line. They were sniffing the exhaust pipes, trying to detect hydrazine or some other illegal rocket fuel cocktail. But all they found was Dino Don, cool as a cucumber, wiping down his valve covers. Here's what most people don't realize about drag racing in that era. It was a self-policing community. If you were fast, people respected you. If you were too fast, people hated you. And Nicholson was suddenly the most hated man in New Jersey. The Chrysler factory teams, the guys running the Sox and Martin cars, were on the phone to their bosses in Detroit within minutes. Ford has something, they said, and if we don't stop it, the season is over. The NHRA tech inspectors descended on Nicholson's car like a swarm of locusts. "Pop the hood," they ordered. Now, usually tech inspection is a formality. They check your safety belts, make sure your battery is tied down, and maybe measure your engine displacement. But this time, they were on a witch hunt. They pulled the valve covers, they measured the bore and stroke, they checked the carburetor part numbers. And this is where the genius of Nicholson's plan really shines. The inspectors looked at those cylinder heads. They looked weird. The intake ports were in the wrong place. The exhaust ports were huge. But when they looked closely at the casting, right there in the aluminum, was a Ford part number. It started with C9, indicating a 1969 design. It had the official Ford oval logo cast right into the metal. The head inspector scratched his head. "This isn't a production head," he said. Nicholson just smiled. "It's a Ford part," he replied, "made by Ford for this engine family. Show me in the rule book where it says I can't run a Ford cylinder head on a Ford engine." Technically, he was right. The Superstock rulebook at the time was vague. It said the engine had to be available from the manufacturer. It didn't explicitly say it had to be installed on a car you could buy at a dealership down the street. It was a loophole the size of a barn door, and Nicholson had just driven a 900 horsepower Maverick right through it. The inspectors were furious, but they were trapped. They couldn't disqualify him because he hadn't broken a specific written rule. They had to let the run stand. Nicholson went on to terrorize the class for the rest of the weekend. Every time that Maverick staged, the outcome was a foregone conclusion. It wasn't a race, it was an execution. But you can only poke the bear for so long before the bear bites back. The pressure from General Motors and Chrysler became overwhelming. They threatened to pull their factory support if the NHRA didn't fix the Ford problem. The argument was simple. If Ford can run experimental prototype parts that never saw a production line, then we should be allowed to run our laboratory experiments too. Chevy threatened to bring out their own overhead cam big block. Chrysler hinted at a 4-valve Hemi. The NHRA realized they were standing on the edge of a cliff. If they allowed this prototype racing to continue, costs would spiral out of control. Privateers would be pushed out. The sport would collapse under the weight of unmitigated spending. So they did the only thing they could do. They didn't disqualify Nicholson retroactively. That would have cost a riot. Instead, they issued a clarification to the rules. It was a polite way of saying ban. The new rule stated that all cylinder heads in Superstock must be regular production items, available in mass quantities, and listed in the standard dealer parts catalog. Overnight, the tunnel port Boss 429 was outlawed. Most racers would have packed up and gone home. They would have swapped the stock heads back onto the car, grumbled about politics, and settled for second place. But remember, we are talking about Dyno Don. The ban didn't stop him, it just liberated him. "Fine," he said. "If I can't race in Superstock, I'll go where the rules don't exist." He moved the Maverick up to the newly formed Pro Stock class. Now, Pro Stock was the Wild West. It was heads-up racing, no handicaps, and the rules were much looser. But even there, he was facing purpose-built tube chassis cars that were far more advanced than his converted street car. This move to Pro Stock forced Nicholson to solve the next major problem: reliability. See, making 900 horsepower for one glory run is one thing. Making it round after round, weekend after weekend, is a completely different engineering challenge. And this is where the story gets technical, because the tunnel port engine had an appetite for destruction. The biggest issue was the block. The Boss 429 block was strong, but when you spin a 7-liter engine to 8,500 RPM, physics starts to get weird. The forces inside the crankcase are violent. The crankshaft tries to flex. The main caps try to walk around. The cylinder walls actually distort from the pressure of combustion. Nicholson realized that standard Ford production blocks were cracking under the stress. He couldn't just buy a stronger block because, again, they didn't exist yet. So he had to invent a solution. He started sonic testing blocks. Sonic testing is where you use ultrasound waves to measure the thickness of the iron in the cylinder walls. He would go through 50 engine blocks just to find one that was slightly thicker than the others due to casting variances. Once he found a good block, he didn't just machine it, he seasoned it. He would leave the block outside in the Michigan winter, let it rust, let it freeze, then bring it in and heat it up.
This cycle of heating and cooling relieved the internal stresses in the cast iron. It sounds like witchcraft, but it worked. It made the iron more stable.
Then there was the oiling system. At 8,500 RPM, the oil inside the engine doesn't just sit in the pan, it turns into a hurricane. The crankshaft spinning at that speed creates a windage cloud of oil droplets that whips around the crank, robbing power and starving the bearings. Nicholson adapted a dry sump oiling system, which was technology borrowed from Indy cars. Instead of letting oil sit in the pan, a scavenger pump sucked it out instantly and sent it to a remote tank. This did two things. It guaranteed the bearings always had pressure, and it removed that windage cloud, freeing up another 15 to 20 horsepower. But the real Achilles heel of the tunnel port was the valve train. Remember those massive valves and the extreme lift? The springs required to control them were incredibly stiff. The pressure on the rocker arms and push rods was immense. Every time the engine ran, it was trying to tear its own valve train apart. Nicholson treated the valve train like a consumable item, the same way you treat tires or fuel. After every few runs, he would tear the top end down. He inspected every spring for micro cracks. He checked the push rods for straightness. If a part looked even slightly suspect, it went in the trash. This level of maintenance was unheard of for a door slammer drag car. It was Formula One levels of obsession applied to a muscle car. And it paid off. In Pro Stock, against the absolute best that Chevy and Chrysler could throw at him, legends like Bill Grumpy Jenkins and Ronnie Sox, Nicholson and his illegal engine held their own. He wasn't just competitive, he was a threat to win every time he unloaded the car. The car became a fan favorite, not just because it was a Ford winning in a sea of Chevys, but because of the sound. There is a distinct audio signature to a tunnel port engine. Because the intake tract is so straight and the exhaust is so free-flowing, the pulses are incredibly sharp. It didn't rumble like a normal V8, it cracked. It sounded angry. When Nicholson did a burnout, the crowd would lean in. They knew they were hearing something that wasn't supposed to exist. But as the 1970 season wore on, the limitations of the production-based architecture started to show. The dedicated Pro Stock chassis being built by the competition were getting lighter and more sophisticated. Nicholson was still wrestling with the geometry of a stock-bodied car. He knew that to stay on top, he would eventually have to move to a tube chassis himself. However, the legacy of that tunnel port engine had already been cemented. He had proven a point that would echo through Ford's engineering department for decades. He proved that the corporate way of doing things, compromise, budget cuts, playing it safe, was the enemy of performance. He proved that one guy with a die grinder and a dream could embarrass a room full of engineers with slide rules. And here is the kicker. Ford was watching. They were watching very closely. The engineers back in Dearborn weren't blind. They saw what Nicholson was doing. And while the suits in the boardroom were worried about budgets and liability, the guys in the dyno cells, the real gearheads, were quietly cheering him on. In fact, this is where the story enters the realm of industrial espionage, or perhaps more accurately, industrial rebellion. There's a legendary story that has circulated in Ford circles for decades about how Nicholson kept that engine running. You see, when you're racing a prototype engine, you can't just go to Napa and buy a replacement rocker arm when one snaps. You need custom parts. And those parts were locked away in Ford's experimental storage facility, gathering dust. Official Ford policy said, "Do not support this program," but unofficial Ford policy, practiced by a handful of sympathetic engineers, was a little different. It went something like this. An engineer would get a call from a friend in Michigan. That engineer would walk into the storage room, find a box of titanium retainers or a specific camshaft blank, and mark it as defective, scrapped. That box would then somehow find its way onto a loading dock, and wouldn't you know it, a truck would just happen to be passing by. Years later, invoices surfaced showing exotic racing parts sold to Nicholson for $1. $1 single dollar. It was the ultimate wink and a nod. These engineers knew that Nicholson was doing the R&D work that they weren't allowed to do.
He was proving their concepts in the real world. In a way, Dino Don wasn't just a privateer racer. He was Ford's unpaid, unsanctioned, and undeniable skunkworks division. This backdoor development didn't just keep Nicholson on the track, it actually shaped the future of Ford performance engines for the next 20 years. If you look at the architecture of the famous 351 Cleveland engine, the engine that would go on to dominate NASCAR and Pro Stock in the hands of guys like Bob Glidden, you can see the DNA of the tunnel port Boss 429. The Cleveland heads use the same canted valve arrangement. They use the same massive port volumes relative to engine size. They were, in essence, the production-friendly version of the lessons learned from the tunnel port program. Ford realized that while the straight-through tunnel design was too radical for a street car, imagine the warranty claims on water leaks, the principle of massive airflow and high RPM capability was sound. Nicholson had proven that a small block or a mid-size block could make big block power if you just let it breathe. So when you see a 1971 Mustang Boss 351, you were looking at the direct descendant of Nicholson's outlaw Maverick. The lineage is undeniable. But let's get back to the cockpit of that Maverick for a second, because we need to talk about what it was actually like to drive this thing. We look at modern drag racing and it's very sterilized. The cars drive straight as an arrow. The tracks are prepped with compounds that are stickier than glue. Computers manage the traction. In 1970, driving a 900 horsepower short wheelbase car was essentially a fistfight with physics. The Maverick has a wheelbase of just 103 inches. That is short. When you apply 700 foot-pounds of torque to a chassis that short, the car doesn't want to go straight. It wants to go sideways. It wants to go up. It wants to kill you.
Nicholson was a master of the 4-speed transmission. And we aren't talking about a modern Lenco with levers you just pull. We are talking about a top-loader gearbox with a heavy clutch and a vertical gate shifter. To get that car down the track, Nicholson had to coordinate his left leg, his right foot, and his right arm with the precision of a neurosurgeon, all while being strapped into a vibrating tin can that was accelerating at 2 Gs. Witnesses from the time described the launch as violent. The car would leave the line with the front wheels 2 feet in the air. But unlike a modern car that carries the wheels smoothly, the Maverick would often slam back down, bounce, and skate toward the center line. Nicholson would be sawing at the steering wheel, correcting the slide, all while keeping his foot buried in the throttle and waiting for the shift light to flash at 8,500 RPM. If he missed a shift, the engine would over-rev and likely explode, turning those rare tunnel port heads into expensive shrapnel. If he shifted too early, the engine would fall out of its narrow power band and bog down. It was a high-wire act with no net. This unpredictability was part of his psychological warfare. When you were in the other lane, you knew 2 things. First, Nicholson was faster than you. Second, his car was a handful. There was a genuine fear factor. You could hear that engine screaming next to you, a sound described as sharper and more piercing than a Hemi, and you knew that he was right on the ragged edge of control. It forced other drivers to overdrive their own cars. They would try to cut a better reaction time and red light. They would try to power shift too hard and miss a gear. Nicholson didn't just beat their cars, he broke their concentration. There is a specific race that highlights just how good this combination was. It was a match race later in the 1970 season. Match races were where the real money was. Exhibition races where tracks would pay big appearance fees to get famous drivers to show up. Nicholson was lined up against a top-tier Chevy Camaro. The Chevy driver did everything right. He cut a perfect light, his car went straight, he ran a personal best ET, and Nicholson drove around him like he was standing still.
But here is the detail that matters. In the pits afterward, Nicholson admitted he had missed 3rd gear. He had actually fluffed the shift. The engine momentarily bounced off the rev limiter, and he had to stab the clutch again to get it into gear. And he still won by a car length. That is the definition of horsepower dominance. When you can make a mistake, a catastrophic driver error, and still win, you aren't just fast, you are in a different league. This era of dominance couldn't last forever, though. As 1971 rolled around, the writing was on the wall. The NHRA was constantly tweaking the rules to slow the cars down. Weight brakes were adjusted. Cubic inch limits were changed. The loophole that Nicholson had exploited was closing. Furthermore, the technology was shifting. The tube chassis cars, the true pro-stock machines, were taking over. These were cars that looked like a Maverick or a Pinto on the outside, but were pure race car underneath. The modified production chassis that Nicholson had started with was becoming obsolete. Nicholson, being the innovator he was, adapted. He moved on to the 351 Cleveland platform, partnering with other legends and eventually building the famous Gap and Roush-style pro-stockers that dominated the mid-70s. But he always looked back on the tunnel-port Boss 429 as his masterpiece. It was the peak of the big-engine, small-car era, before aerodynamics and chassis tech took over. For collectors and historians, the tunnel port era is frustratingly mysterious. Because so few sets of heads were made, estimates range from 20 to maybe 50 sets total, and because many were destroyed or blown up in competition, finding a genuine set today is like finding a dinosaur bone. There are rumors, always rumors, of a set sitting on a shelf in a garage in Detroit covered in 50 years of dust. Every few years, a set pops up on an internet forum or an auction site. The bidding goes insane. We are talking $50,000 for a pair of bare castings. Why? Because they represent the ultimate what if.
What if Ford had stuck with it? What if they had put the tunnel port into the Mustang Boss 429 production car? It would have been a warranty nightmare, sure. The street drivability would have been terrible, but it would have ended the argument. There would be no Hemi versus Boss. The tunnel port would have simply suffocated the competition. It represents a moment in time when engineering ambition outstripped corporate caution. It was the last gasp of the total war mentality of the 60s, before the gas crisis and emissions regulations of the 70s strangled American performance. And this brings us to a fascinating technical footnote that often gets overlooked: the intake manifold. I mentioned earlier that Nicholson had to fabricate his own, but think about the physics of that for a second. In 1970, we didn't have 3D modeling. We didn't have computational fluid dynamics software to simulate airflow. Nicholson and his team designed that intake using wet flow visualization, literally spraying dye into air and watching where it went, and sheer intuition. They built a spider manifold with a central plenum and long, isolated runners. This design, which looked crude, actually pioneered the concept of tuned length runners for V8s. They discovered that by changing the length of the intake tube, they could move the torque peak around in the RPM band. Longer tubes for torque, shorter tubes for top-end power. This is standard knowledge today. Your modern Ford F-150 has a variable length intake manifold that does this automatically, but Nicholson was doing it with sheet aluminum and a welding torch in a garage in Michigan. He was tuning the sound waves inside the engine manually. It's these details that separate the mechanics from the maestros. Nicholson wasn't just bolting parts together, he was visualizing the invisible forces of physics and manipulating them to his will. You have to remember, Nicholson wasn't operating in a vacuum. He was swimming in a shark tank. The names he was up against, Bill Grumpy Jenkins, Ronnie Sox, Dick Landy, these weren't just racers, they were institutions. Grumpy Jenkins had the entire engineering might of Chevrolet backdooring him parts. Ronnie Sox had the full weight of the Chrysler Corporation. These teams had tractor-trailers, spare engines, and crews of specialized mechanics. Nicholson? He had a flatbed truck, a small crew of loyal friends, and a brain that worked faster than a calculator. There is a specific anecdote about Grumpy Jenkins that illustrates this rivalry perfectly. Jenkins was known for being, well, grumpy. He was a brilliant engineer who hated losing more than he liked winning. When Nicholson showed up with the tunnel port, Jenkins was one of the first to spot it. He walked past Nicholson's pit, took one look at the headers and the angle of the spark plugs, and stopped dead in his tracks. He knew.
He didn't need to see the casting numbers. He understood geometry. He knew that the only way the spark plugs could be angled like that was if the ports were moved. Jenkins reportedly went back to his own trailer and started throwing wrenches. He knew he was bringing a knife to a gunfight. That is the ultimate compliment in racing, when your mere presence causes a legend like Grumpy Jenkins to lose his cool before the engine is even fired. But let's pivot for a second and talk about the ghost factor. What happens to a banned engine when the season ends? Usually, race parts get sold off to lower-level sportsman racers. They trickle down the food chain. But the tunnel port parts were different. Because they were so specialized, remember, you needed the custom intake, the custom rockers, the custom pistons. You couldn't just sell the heads to a local guy for his street car. They were useless without the rest of the ecosystem. So, they vanished.
Nicholson was a smart businessman. He knew that if he sold these parts, his secrets would be out. Someone else would reverse engineer his work. So, rumor has it, he buried some of them. Literally. There are stories of damaged tunnel port heads being used as doorstops in his shop, or buried in the backyard of his property to keep them away from prying eyes. It adds to the mystique. Somewhere in Michigan, under a layer of topsoil, there might be the remnants of the most controversial cylinder heads in Ford history. For the modern enthusiast, it is hard to grasp just how far ahead of its time this stuff was. Let's look at a modern reference point. The Ford 5.0-liter Coyote V8 found in a brand new Mustang GT is a marvel of engineering. It has dual overhead cams, 4 valves per cylinder, variable valve timing, and computer-controlled direct injection. It makes about 480 horsepower from 5 liters, or 302 cubic inches. That is roughly 1.6 horsepower per cubic inch. Nicholson's 1970 pushrod engine with a single carburetor and fixed valve timing was making over 2 horsepower per cubic inch. He was beating modern efficiency with Stone Age tools. How? It comes down to something called discharge coefficient. It's a fancy engineering term for how efficiently air moves past a valve. Modern engines rely on computers to optimize the mixture. Nicholson relied on velocity. By making the ports straight, he kept the air moving so fast that it literally rammed itself into the cylinder. It's a concept called inertial supercharging. When the intake valve opens, the column of air in that massive runner is moving at hundreds of feet per second. When the piston reaches the bottom and starts to come back up, that air is still rushing in with so much momentum that it continues to fill the cylinder, even as the piston is trying to push it out. He was essentially using the weight of the air itself to force feed the engine. It's natural aspiration, but it acts like boost. This specific technology, inertial supercharging through straight ports, trickled down. It didn't happen overnight, and it didn't happen in road cars immediately, but if you look at the Ford Yates heads used in NASCAR in the 1990s, they are the spiritual successors to the tunnel port. The high port designs used in modern Pro stock, they are the great-grandchildren of the Nicholson Maverick. The tragedy, if there is one, is that the public never got a taste of it. Imagine if Ford had built a Boss 302 tunnel port for the street. Imagine a 1970 Mustang that revved to 8,000 RPM from the factory. It would have changed the perception of the brand forever. Instead of being known for torquey but breathless engines, Ford could have been the American Ferrari. But the executives chose safety. They chose the path of least resistance.
And that is why stories like this matter. They remind us that the best technology doesn't always win in the marketplace. Sometimes the best technology gets killed in a boardroom meeting because it's too expensive, too radical, or too risky. The tunnel port was the Concorde of cylinder heads, technically superior, unbelievably fast, but ultimately grounded by politics and economics. We also have to talk about the dry deck concept, which is a super nerdy detail that usually gets glossed over. One of the problems Nicholson faced was keeping the head gasket sealed with that much cylinder pressure. The standard Boss 429 used a wet deck, meaning there were water passages between the block and the head. If the head lifted even 1/1000th of an inch under power, combustion gas would blow into the cooling system, pressurizing the radiator and spraying water under the tires. That is a death sentence at 150 miles per hour. Nicholson modified his block and heads to be a dry deck. He plugged the water passages on the deck surface and routed the water externally through hoses. This meant that even if the head gasket leaked compression, it wouldn't push water out, it just leaked air. It was a safety redundancy that showed his genius. He wasn't just trying to go fast, he was trying to survive. He anticipated failure and engineered a way to manage it. This technique is standard practice in top fuel and pro mod today. In 1970, it was unheard of in a door car. He was inventing safety protocols that the rulebook hadn't even thought of yet. It's also worth noting the financial gamble Nicholson took. He wasn't a factory team fully funded by Ford. He had support, yes, but if he blew that engine up, he was the one staying up for 3 days straight to fix it. He was the one paying the mortgage on his shop. Every time he dropped the clutch at 8,500 RPM, he was betting his livelihood on his own engineering. There is a visceral courage in that. Today, if an F1 engine blows up, it's a data point on a spreadsheet. If Nicholson's tunnel port blew up, he might not make it to the next race. He might lose his sponsorship. The stakes were personal. As we move toward the final chapter of this engine's life, we have to acknowledge the cultural shift it represented. The tunnel port Boss 429 was the end of an era. By 1972, compression ratios were dropping, unleaded fuel was on the horizon, the EPA was cracking down. The party was ending. Nicholson's Maverick was like the grand finale of a fireworks show, the biggest, loudest, brightest explosion right before the sky went dark. It was the maximum expression of what was possible when there were no rules, cheap gas, and engineers who didn't know the meaning of the word impossible. The fact that it was banned makes it even more poetic. It wasn't retired because it was obsolete. It was retired because it was unfair. It was a victim of its own success. In the world of racing, a ban is the highest honor you can receive. It means you broke the game. You forced the organizers to admit that their rules weren't good enough to contain you.
So, where does that leave us today? Why are we still talking about a 50-year-old engine that ran for only 3 months before being kicked out of the sport? Because the tunnel port Boss 429 is the ultimate what if. It challenges our entire understanding of muscle car hierarchy. We have been conditioned to believe that the 426 Hemi was the undisputed king of the hill. It's the engine that gets all the press, all the movie cameos, and the million-dollar auction results. But Nicholson's Maverick proved that the king had a glass jaw. It proved that Ford had the technology to dethrone the Hemi, but they lacked the corporate nerve to pull the trigger. It's a reminder that history is written by the victors, but sometimes the best technology is on the losing side of the boardroom vote. If you look at the modern landscape of Ford performance, the ghost of the tunnel port is still haunting the engineering department. Look at the new 7.3-liter Godzilla truck engine. It's a massive pushrod V8. It has monster displacement. And what does it have? Straight, vertical intake ports that shoot air directly at the valve. 50 years later, Ford finally put the tunnel port concept into mass production, not for a race car, but for a Super Duty work truck. It's poetic justice. The technology that was once too radical for racing is now towing your boat to the lake. But for the die-hard enthusiasts, the original tunnel port remains the holy grail. I have spoken to collectors who have spent decades hunting for these parts. They track down rumors of old race shops closing down. They search estate sales of former Ford engineers. Finding a tunnel port head is like finding a verified piece of the true cross for a Ford guy. When these parts do surface, they don't just sell, they vanish into private collections. There is a verified set that changed hands a few years ago. The price wasn't disclosed publicly, but the insurance valuation was rumored to be north of $60,000 for 2 chunks of aluminum. That is the power of the legend. People aren't buying the metal, they are buying the story. They are buying the physical proof that for one brief moment, a guy named Dino Don broke the laws of physics. And speaking of Dino Don, he raced for many more years. He won championships. He became a legend in his own right. But in interviews before he passed away, when people asked him about his favorite car, he always went back to that 1970 Maverick. He called it the wildest ride I ever had. He knew he had caught lightning in a bottle. He knew he had gotten away with something special. There is a lesson here for all of us. Whether you are building a race car, starting a business, or just trying to solve a problem in your garage, the official way isn't always the best way. The rule book is often just a suggestion. And sometimes you have to look at a pile of discarded, banned parts and see the potential that everyone else missed. Innovation doesn't usually happen in the center of the spotlight. It happens in the shadows. It happens in the loopholes. It happens when someone like Nicholson looks at a dead end and sees a shortcut. We live in an era now where cars are becoming appliances. They are fast, sure. A Tesla Plaid will out-accelerate that Maverick without making a sound. But does it have a soul? Does it have a story? Does it represent the struggle of one man against a corporation? No. That is why we cling to these stories. The Tunnelport Boss 429 isn't just an engine, it's a monument to human ingenuity. It's a mechanical middle finger to the establishment. It's 900 horsepower of I told you so. So the next time you are at a car show and you see a Boss 429 Mustang, take a moment to appreciate it. It's a beautiful car. But then close your eyes and imagine what could have been. Imagine a world where Ford had the guts to release the Tunnelport. Imagine the idol of that 900 horsepower monster shaking the showroom floor. Imagine the history books being rewritten. That is the legacy motoring spirit. We don't just look at what happened, we look at what almost happened. We celebrate the near misses, the banned prototypes, and the forgotten heroes who went too fast for their own good. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the most controversial engine in Ford history, I need you to do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button below. We have a list of other banned engines we are researching right now. Chevy's Mystery Motor, the Mopar Ball Stud Hemi, and a few others that I can't even mention yet because the sources are still terrified of getting sued. Also, drop a comment down below. I want to know, if you could build a phantom muscle car, a car that the factory should have built but didn't, what would it be? Would it be a 427 Camaro station wagon? A Hemi-powered Plymouth Cricket? Or maybe a Tunnelport Boss 429 in a Pinto? Let me know your wildest factory what-if build in the comments. And hey, if you learned something new today, if you now know the difference between a wet deck and a dry deck, or why 14:1 compression on pump gas is a bad idea, give this video a like. It helps the algorithm find other gearheads like us who are obsessed with this stuff. Thanks for watching. Thanks for keeping the history alive. And remember, if the rulebook doesn't say you can't do it, that means you must do it.